two questions directed at anyone or the entire panel, and I'll be passing by with a mic because we're recording here.
As a question for, thank you very much for your presentation, it's very inspiring. I have a question for Guaraldo about this notion that recur in Lonzi's writing, which is the authenticity. And so I would like to know what's your reading of Lonzi's authenticity and the shift that there is from authenticity to uniqueness and singularity.
From authenticity
to singular uniqueness in sense of in sense of Arendt and obviously the take of Cavarero on the idea of uniqueness.
Well, I am not so an expert of Carla Lonzi to know exactly all the different occurrences of this term authenticity, but it's true that she refers to it very much. And I don't know, because in Cavarero, for example, or in Arendt, it's not a common term, and it's maybe criticized also by Arendt by the fact that it seems to refer to an inner reality that should come out. I don't know. I don't know about Lonzi. The way I perceive it, at least, it's not in this sense. I perceive it as rather than something that it's already inside that has to come out, as a sort of something that you discover in the development of your becoming aware of, or the consciousness or the autocoscienza process. But I think it's something that doesn't exist before, so to say. I don't know. I'm not sure, but I don't perceive it as this, this propriety or whatever. It's
This is a question for the two philosophers. The problem of the biopolitical and the transformation of the subject into human capital. And just thinking of what you said about the void and the risks of, I think you might have linked the void, this very paradoxical way of thinking the void and subjectivity to madness in some way, but that's an aside. Do you think we need to re-subjectivate as a way of taking on or finding some resistance to the governmentality that produces us as mere specks of human capital? And would this involve the void in some way? This is just, how do we begin to resist or transform the biopolitical desubjectivation of us into specks of human capital, where relationality becomes competition, where the self is really to do with enhancing and producing a portfolio with the idea of finding credit in investment? How do we actually transform that situation, and is the void part of that?
Well, I think this is a very interesting way of putting it that I didn't think about. And this perhaps this is Lonzi's heritage of the void could be used to, because to me the main problem, I think to all of us, the main problem is what to do, because we have enough diagnoses. We have many diagnoses, but we lack praxis. We lack praxis. I think it's a very interesting way of putting it, of this going back to the void. I will have to think about it.
I would have found your question very perplexing if we didn't have, talked before. I know this is a psychoanalytical driven question, is it not? Slightly, yeah. Okay then. Yeah.
And certainly you can see that from a Lacanian perspective, the void, but I'm really not reducing this to the Lacanian perspective. I know that there are many ways that one can think the void.
That's exactly the problem. It seems to me that we have bigger problems right now as women in the actual real world than thinking about the void or the phallus. Stiegler says, bringing back what we were talking about before, let's not think even in terms of the phallus or in terms of desire. Let's think in terms of what we do, how we will create the circumstances or the conditions in which we will face de-individualization, not desubjectivization. Coming from a particular philosophical tradition or psychoanalytic tradition, it's even more difficult to think not in terms of the void or not in terms of subjectivity, but this is exactly what I learned from process philosophy and from reading Cavarero and reading Arendt, that sometimes you need to lay down your theoretical weapons or tools in order to start thinking differently. If void happens to be the right tool along the line, yes, I will use it, but what does it really mean to start thinking resubjectivization or whatever in terms of, along the lines of the void to start with? That I do not know. I don't think it's a good move. If it appears down the line, I think that's what you're trying to say as well, any theoretical idea, if it's useful down the line, let's use it.
I would like to take a cue from Olivia's talk to ask a question to the three speakers from earlier, because Olivia, you said this void is not something that you have. I mean, in Lonzi's thinking, the void is not something that you have to feel, but it's something that you allow to emerge. And I think it was so important when you said that resonance for her is this very complex idea that is perhaps associated also with a focus on the voice and the use of voice recording that she not only did in Autoritratto, but she also did later for the dialogue with Consagra. But this idea of the void is also, I think, a reminder of being creative, and which is something that she writes also in her text, being creative about creativity without the guarantee of culture, senza le garanzie della cultura. And we know what she means by culture is male culture, is identity, so on and so forth. You called it the polis today, I think is an interesting way of putting it. And especially if I'm thinking about the queer practices that were discussed earlier, or le messiache, they both operate without the guarantees of culture. It's so interesting how working in the public space there doesn't necessarily entail to occupy a space of the polis, but to do something which do you need the term art to define it? It is expression, and I'm borrowing this word from Suzanne Santoro, is expression, is creativity, and I wanted to trigger these some thoughts about this, about doing without art, doing without culture, and see whether rather than work, and the self-defined through work, by either the artwork or work as labor, we might probably let life emerge. And that is, life, resonance. I'm just putting these two things together that in Lonzi's thinking, that very often they appear together.
And also to add to Francesco's comment, this idea of risk for me sounds much more optimistic in the sense that Jeanette Winterson coined this wonderfully well. What you risk reveals what you value. So at the moment that you don't see art as a value system, what would that possibly produce? And the number of you, there were lots of interesting resubjectivizing moments, as well as that. That void was filled with other much more life-affirming activities. If any one of you would like to take up an elaboration of these activities, of what that means in terms of cultural practice.
Well, I think you are absolutely right. It's in the case of Le Musique, for them, it was really starting a practice from their own subjectivity and from their own life experiences. So everything that came from their life every day, their shared community, going out together, trying to occupy spaces, then went into creating production, into creating something together. But the starting point was really like their life experience without considering any sort of like cultural reference or normal cultural reference that would refer back to the men's world. So a community of women living together and trying to describe themselves to each other freely without the use of, I don't know, really like a life experience that was based on their shared moments together. So everything started from, I think, an attempt to redefine themselves. And so, and the art, I would use the word creativity, but I wouldn't be scared of using the word art because they were using the word art themselves. And I think they also wanted to be an affirmation, a statement towards the rest of the world. It wasn't just self-reflective. And I think the fact that we're using the word art is important itself, as art can be something outside of the art it is. So yeah, I think that's...
For the cooperative, I think well, we need to think that they were professional artists, so I think they identified themselves as artists. So they tried to get out the artistic references, so that were usually from the male culture. So they tried to experiment a possible different imagery and also try to find in a space that was not a gallery art, so gallery of art, so disconnected the artworks from a mission, economic mission, a value in terms of economic. Yeah, I think there was this try to create aesthetically something new in terms of expression, and so maybe they focus more in the, as I said, in what there was behind in terms of process, and not in the result. Not always, they were different, but maybe in this time of production they were most focused on in this, try to get out from all the artistic representation known until that moment.
I probably wanted to reflect about the resubjectivation that you were addressing before, and how this is really relevant in all artistic feminist collectives, and I think that their operation really addresses this problem, even if not explicitly, but the issue of resubjectivizing themselves and not working through finding an identity falsely, but this relational practice between the collectives, it's one that identifies within the emotional impact between the members of the collectives and what they live in terms of economic affects, not economic, commercial and product. And to link back to what Olivia was mentioning before, by quoting Carla Lonzi and how feminism is important to pass from aspiration to reality, I also think that this need of doing, of this immediacy and necessity of doing, of becoming something in relation to the collective is something that has to be taken into consideration for this issue about the lack of subjectivity and finding this today, now.
I think this will be we'll probably just take 2 questions and end with those. So I'll hand. There's 2 questions. I think we can take both and then answer and conclude.
Yeah. I just wanted to make a quick response to my own question in relation to what's been said. If you're moving from to this moment, just exactly how you put it, and I just can't find the words now, where you move from, yes, something that hasn't been dealt with at all in the few days that I've been part of this wonderful event is the movement that in Deleuze might be described. I'm just finding difficult to try and sort of point to what I want to point to. Deleuze would talk about it as deterritorialization or destratification. But from, let's say from a psychoanalytic point of view, or even Ernesta Leclerc and Chantal Mouffe, for instance, if you invest your libido into a certain kind of cathexis, a certain type of biopolitical way of being, or a certain kind of governmentality or hegemony, I'm mixing all these kinds of metaphysics together, and you want to go somewhere surprising, you want to go somewhere new, you want to get exit, you want to withdraw from that, there is a process where you have to destitute those investments. You have to destratify, deterritorialize, destitute certain kinds of libidinal investments. You have to destroy a certain series of identifications, certain phantasmatic structures and imaginaries that support you in that governmentality of, say, neoliberal capitalism or patriarchy or heteronormative, whatever, in order to go somewhere else. So to act outside that framework involves a destruction creation. The jouissance that comes from all of that, exactly, and the phantasmatic that produces that jouissance. So there's a massive amount of destitution, and that's where I think the void comes in, and I think this is relevant in many different metaphysics, not only the Lacanian one, where you have to move to an act of radically not knowing where you're going. You're at a limit of radical non-knowledge and you have to act. And that's where I think the void and the risk and perhaps even madness, because I think you mentioned madness, which is very much the French feminist, Christavian sort of trajectory. So I just want to say that's where, despite the metaphysics, we have to unwork, destitute, disidentify in order to recreate.
And the next Now You
And
Can
fail.
Go project will involve
And
a
also
psychosocial dimension.
Fail.
And to fail.
Be ready to fail.
We'll be taking one more question and then we'll answer that and we'll come to the end, I'm afraid.
It's a question for Olivia. I wanted to ask you, so going back to the 70s when there was the discussion on abortion in the early 70s, and then in Italy there was the legalization of abortion in 1978, Rivolta Femminile and other feminists had a very interesting proposal and a very interesting diagnosis and then proposal of women, subjectivity and autonomy in relation to abortion, so they asked for the decriminalization of abortion instead of the legalization of abortion. So they asked for women to be allowed to have an abortion in hospital when they needed, and for women-run clinic. It has failed. Women wanted to legalize abortion, but I'm thinking, what do you think in relation? Will this have happen again in Italy when some hospital, for instance, we have in some hospital 100% of doctors who don't want to do abortion who don't want to perform abortion anymore on women, and women are forced to drive 100 miles to go to the next hospital where they are allowed to have an abortion. So it's a very serious issue. And just a few hundred miles from here in Ireland, they're still asking for the legalization of abortion. But I think, what are we missing as women in the chance to go back to a decriminalization of abortion? And
psychosocial approaches to subjectivity and identity and liberation. And furthermore, the abortion issues entailed in Italy and also Ireland, the distinction between decriminalization and legalization.
No, actually, I think it's what is very interesting, and and I think I will give it for a possible study if I find a student that is willing to do it, is at the end of this Biopolitics, this text, there is several letters that Lonzi and her group wrote to Corriere della Sera during the debate over abortion, and the response they did to Pasolini, who was against, you know. So, but I think I just sort of grasped some, because I don't know the whole story, the whole polemics that's behind there. But from what I grasped, I don't know, maybe you know better, they were paradoxically in agreement with Pasolini, who was against, because Pasolini said this will be another victory of patriarchy, because then they will be able to fuck whenever they want without taking any responsibility. And they respond, and I mean, in this Biopolitics there is the text, and they, from what I learned, they agreed with him. So they were against the legalization of abortion on these terms, that it was a man-driven or state-driven type of law over women's bodies. So they offer the opposite perspective, now decriminalization. This is there are many different positions on this, and I think also pragmatical positions of those times that knew that that was the only possible passable law, and it was better to go for that rather than have nothing. And yes, I know about today's very difficult situation for people, for women who want to go in hospital and have an abortion, because there are so many obiettori, how do you say? Yes, because doctors in Italy can refuse, for religious or ethical reasons, they can refuse to do an abortion, even if it's legal and in every hospital. So it's has become pragmatically. But you know, today the issue is more on how to do babies rather than how to not do babies. This is another biopolitical issue that should be really thought about.
Well, That's an interesting tone, but I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it here. I'd like to thank everyone for being here, participating, enduring with this great project. And I also want to extend a huge thank you to Helena Reckett for really organizing our asses throughout this whole period. Thanks, Helena Reckett.